This news slipped on unknown websites and a strange Twitter account, and the White House immediately called it fake. However, while White House officials were saying that this was not true, Trump suddenly wrote in his social network, "Now is a great time to buy." As he was writing this, the stock market had hit its low. Everything was falling because of fears about tariffs, which Trump himself led. Especially huge tariffs were imposed against China, as much as 104%. Then Trump raised them again. On the 9th of April, at 8:37 in the morning, Trump writes this post in a coward, and 3 hours later, the following statement comes out. Because of the disrespect that China shows to world markets, I am raising US tariffs on China to 125%. This takes effect immediately. And at the same time, he says that the rest of the world gets a 90-day reprieve for its good behavior. And then, as if on a click, the world markets begin to grow. Not only American, but everyone else. All markets are taking off sharply. It's not just a coincidence. It was a masterfully played game. If you knew what he was going to do, you could make a fortune in a few hours. And all that was needed was to get ahead of Trump. He himself said that this is a great time to buy, and turned out to be right. But how could he have predicted it so accurately? Yes, because he knew what he was going to do, what he was going to say, and what he was going to publish. It was pure manipulation. And by the way, there was one person who knew about this before, and, as for me, he was treated very unfairly. This is Walter Bloomberg. Maybe you've heard his name, because he was mentioned in the news very often recently. He said on Monday that Trump was reviewing a 90-day tariff deferral for all countries except China. But then the White House said no, it's fake news. And as a result, articles began to come out about this guy, which essentially said, "This is how fake news about tariffs published on Twitter overturned the markets by trillions of dollars. Now anyone can write anything on the internet, and people will just believe it." But was he wrong? It seems to me that he was the first to realize that there would be a pause on tariffs even before everyone else. And in fact, he was right. And to be honest, I even felt some pity for this guy, because he was the first one to guess, but he was muddied for it. But the most interesting thing is that even he could not realize that he was right. But in the end, we all saw what happened. 90-day pause on tariffs except for China. How could he have foreseen this situation? For example, looking at the US bond market, whose yields have skyrocketed. And for every 0.1% increase in this indicator, the United States will have to pay $36 billion more interest on debt servicing. This is the opposite of Trump's stated goal, because he seeks to lower rates. As a result, he found himself in a nightmare situation when the S&P 500 index fell by almost 15%. And the yield on Treasury bonds rose by 10%. In the last 48 hours alone, it has grown by 55 basis points. In other words, Trump has a nightmare situation right now where we have higher rates while stocks are in recession. I think someone big drained American bonds, for example China. A leading asset manager claims that it was actually Japan, not China, that sold bonds last night, which stirred up the bond market and forced Trump to pause on tariffs. China, Japan, anyone else, it doesn't matter. A major player was selling us bonds, which caused a sharp rise in yields. And just 8 hours after this growth, Trump announces a pause in tariffs. If necessary, they will hit the same point until Trump becomes more compliant than anyone else in the world. Of course, this is a double-edged sword, but still they found Trump's Achilles heel. This is bond yields, not the stock market. It is bond yields that Trump cares about, and all his decisions are related to the bond market. And we will also be able to use this for our own purposes. For example, Deutsche Bank understands this because it made the following statement. If the recent turmoil in the US Treasury bond market continues, we see no other choice for the US Federal Reserve but to intervene and bring emergency purchases of US Treasury bonds to stabilize the market. This is called emergency quantitative easing. Here's what we can expect if bond yields continue to rise and the big players continue to sell them. And that's what added fuel to the fire even more. Some began to say that the tariffs were canceled, All this is just an attempt to save face. But it's much more complicated than it looks. The market rejoices as if the tariff wars are over. But in fact, according to Goldman Registry Office, even with Trump's pause announced today, given the increase in Chinese duties, the effective tariff rate of duties is still about 25%, and back in January, a few months ago, it was only 2%. In addition, for some reason, the market missed the news that tariffs on China are not only not put on pause, they have been increased to 125%. Yesterday, this rate was 104%, and a few days ago, it was 54%. Tariffs on China are growing faster than Bitcoin on bullrun. In short, Trump gracefully raised tariffs so that in the end, the market was even happy about it. You know how to raise taxes by 30%, see how people are outraged, and then reduce these taxes to 20%. And everyone will rejoice and praise you. The tariffs still remained. The same 10% of tariffs that no one canceled. At the same time, we have record tariffs on China, which, by the way, declares that if this situation is not resolved, it will fight to the very end. And a 90-day pause is not the end of the story. And that's what the White House is saying. I can add to what the finance minister said. Many of you media have not realized that this is the art of the deal. You haven't seen what President Trump is doing. You thought that the rest of the world would get closer to China, but in fact the opposite happened. The whole world turns to the United States, not to China, because they need our market and our consumers. They want a meeting with our president to discuss this. That's why more than 75 countries have already turned to us, because the USA is the best place on earth for business. By the way, Peter Navarro, Trump's economic advisor, also spoke. He also said that this is one of the greatest economic days in the history of the United States. This is one of the greatest days in the history of the US economy. I think we'll call it the art of mutual trade deal. And all those nervous Wall Street traders who tried to undermine us have always underestimated the power of Trump's negotiations.